This documentary is presented to you in the form of an audiobook. After the 2008 financial crisis, a quote supposedly from Karl Marx went viral. The owners of capital will stimulate working-class consumption, pushing them to take on unbearable debt until banks collapse and require nationalization. This eerily accurate prediction of the subprime mortgage crisis spread across social media and even academic circles. The only problem, Marx never wrote those words. It was a modern fabrication. Yet beyond internet myths, Marx's actual 19th century writings contain passages that genuinely do seem to anticipate aspects of our 21st century reality. What did this philosopher truly foresee about capitalism's future? Which authentic insights cut through time to describe our world today? The answers lie not in viral misquotes, but in the original texts themselves. Historical analysis requires nuance, especially when examining apparent predictions. We'll approach Marx not as prophet but as analyst, carefully distinguishing between genuine foresight and retroactive interpretation. Our focus will be on his major works including Das Kapital, published in 1867, the Communist Manifesto of 1848, and his notebook manuscripts Grundrisse, written in 1858 but unpublished until the 20th century. Marx's most striking insights fall into three categories: economic predictions about capitalism's evolution toward concentration and crisis, technological predictions about automation and the transformation of work, and social predictions about class dynamics and globalization. For each we'll examine his actual text, the historical context in which he wrote, and the analytical method that allowed him to identify these enduring patterns. Marx's economic analysis produced some of his most striking insights into capitalism's future development. In Volume 1 of Das Kapital, published in 1867, Marx wrote, "The battle of competition is fought by the cheapening of commodities. The cheapness of commodities depends, all other circumstances remaining the same, on the productivity of labour, and this again on the scale of production. Therefore, the larger capitals beat the smaller." This passage from chapter 25 describes what we now recognize as market concentration. Marx identified the inherent tendency toward monopoly not as a corruption of capitalism, but as its logical outcome. By 2025, we've witnessed precisely this process across industries from technology to retail to banking. The mechanism Marx identified, economies of scale enabling larger firms to produce more cheaply and thus outcompete smaller rivals, continues to drive consolidation today. 2 decades earlier, in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, Marx and Engels wrote this remarkable passage on globalization. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. Written when international trade was a fraction of today's volume, this passage anticipates our interconnected global economy with uncanny precision. Marx recognized that capitalism's need for growth would inevitably break through national boundaries, creating the worldwide supply chains and international markets that define our era. On financial crises, Marx wrote in Theories of Surplus Value, 1863, "The world trade crises must be regarded as the real concentration and forcible adjustment of all the contradictions of bourgeois economy." Marx identified the cyclical nature of capitalist crises, seeing them not as aberrations but as inherent features of the system. While he couldn't predict specific crashes like 2008, he outlined the structural tensions that produce them. He understood that economic crises aren't simply failures of policy or regulation, but expressions of capitalism's internal contradictions, periodic adjustments necessary to the system's continuation. His most prescient financial insight appears in Volume 3 of Das Kapital, published posthumously in 1894, where Marx analysed what he called fictitious capital. With the development of interest-bearing capital and the credit system, all capital seems to double itself and sometimes treble itself. The greater portion of this money capital is purely fictitious. Long before the complex financial derivatives of our era, Marx recognized how financial instruments could become detached from actual production, creating paper wealth with no corresponding basis in physical assets or productive capacity. This analysis anticipated the massive expansion of speculative financial products that characterized the derivatives market before the 2008 crash. The concept of fictitious capital precisely describes the mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps that eventually triggered that crisis. Marx's analysis of technology and its relationship to labour reveals some of his most forward-looking insights. In his notebook Manuscripts Grundrisse, written in 1858 but not published until the 20th century, Marx made this remarkable observation about automation. Once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labour passes through different metamorphoses, whose culmination is the machine, or rather, an automatic system of machinery, set in motion by an automaton, a moving power that moves itself. This passage is extraordinary not just for anticipating automated production systems, but for recognizing their self-regulating nature. Written over 160 years ago, Marx envisioned not merely simple machines, but integrated systems with their own autonomous functioning, something akin to the AI-driven production we see emerging today. He foresaw that automation would not simply be discrete machines, but interconnected systems with their own operational logic. On technology's displacement of human labour, Marx wrote in Volume 1 of Das Kapital, "The instrument of labour, when it takes the form of a machine, immediately becomes a competitor of the worker himself. The entire system of capitalist production is based on the fact that the worker sells his labour power as a commodity." Marx understood that machines would increasingly compete with human labour, a dynamic we're witnessing with unprecedented intensity in today's AI and robotics revolution. Unlike those who viewed technological advancement as inherently beneficial, Marx recognized the fundamental tension when technology is deployed within a profit-driven system. Efficiency gains can translate into worker displacement rather than universal benefit. In Grundrisse, Marx made another observation that seems particularly relevant to our digital economy. Labour no longer appears so much to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as watchman and regulator to the production process itself. This shift from direct physical labour to monitoring and regulating automated processes precisely describes many contemporary jobs in advanced economies. Marx anticipated how workers would evolve from being direct producers to overseers of production, from manual labour to what we now call knowledge work. This transformation has accelerated dramatically with computerization and continues with the advancement of AI systems that humans increasingly design, train and supervise rather than replace. Perhaps most insightful was Marx's recognition that technology would not necessarily reduce working hours. In Das Kapital, Volume 1, he wrote, "Machinery, while augmenting the human material that forms capital's most characteristic field of exploitation, at the same time raises the degree of that exploitation." Rather than technology freeing us from work, Marx observed that it often intensifies and extends work. This insight contradicted the utopian view that technological progress would automatically reduce working hours and increase leisure. Instead, we've seen technology blur the boundaries between work and home life, from email checking after hours to the always-on expectations of digital workplaces. The promised leisure dividend of technological productivity has largely failed to materialize, just as Marx suspected. Marx's Prescience, Social and Political Predictions section. Marx's social analysis extends beyond economics into broader cultural and political transformations. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote their famous observation about class polarization. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. While modern society has more complex stratification than this binary suggests, the concentration of wealth among a tiny percentage of the global population indicates Marx identified an enduring tension. The 21st century has seen wealth inequality reach levels not witnessed since the Gilded Age, with data showing how capital ownership has become increasingly concentrated. Marx's fundamental insight about the structural conflict between capital and labour continues to manifest, albeit in more complex forms than he anticipated. On the accelerating pace of social change, Marx and Engels penned one of their most poetic passages in the Communist Manifesto. All fixed, fast-frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. This lyrical description captures the disorienting speed of social transformation under capitalism. Traditions, institutions, and social norms continuously disrupted by market forces. Written in 1848, this passage anticipates our contemporary experience of rapid technological and social change, where established patterns are constantly overturned. From family structures to cultural expressions, the relentless dynamism Marx identified has only accelerated with digital technology. In Grundrisse, Marx observed a dynamic that perfectly anticipates our information economy. The development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production. Marx recognized knowledge itself would become a central productive force, the cornerstone of our information economy. He understood that capitalism would eventually incorporate intellectual and creative capacities as primary sources of value, rather than merely physical labor. This insight anticipated today's knowledge economy, where data, algorithms, and intellectual property generate enormous value. On media and information control, Marx wrote in The German Ideology, 1846, "The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production." This analysis anticipates contemporary concerns about media concentration and information gatekeeping. Marx recognized that economic power translates into narrative power, the ability to shape perception and discourse. His insight remains relevant to discussions about platform monopolies, algorithmic curation, and the political economy of information distribution. On cultural globalization, Marx and Engels made this observation in the Communist Manifesto. National differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. This passage anticipates the cultural homogenization that accompanies economic globalization. Marx recognized that market expansion creates not just economic integration, but cultural convergence. The worldwide spread of similar consumption patterns, architectural forms, and lifestyle aspirations we now associate with globalization. Finally, in his early Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, 1844, Marx analyzed alienation in a way that speaks directly to contemporary work conditions. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. This early analysis of alienation captures the paradox of increasing productivity alongside wage stagnation. Marx identified how workers can experience their productive capacity as something foreign to them, a dynamic exacerbated in today's gig economy with its precarious employment and algorithmic management. His insight about the psychological and social costs of treating labor purely as a commodity remains relevant to contemporary discussions about work-life balance, burnout, and mental health in the workplace. Marx's most accurate insights weren't mystical prophecies, but the result of rigorous analysis of capitalism's internal dynamics. His method, examining contradictions within economic systems to understand their developmental tendencies, allowed him to identify patterns that continue to unfold today. By recognizing capitalism as a historical system, with its own internal logic and tensions, Marx could perceive trajectories invisible to those who viewed market relations as natural or timeless. Yet Marx also had significant blind spots. He underestimated capitalism's adaptability and capacity for reform. He didn't anticipate how the welfare state would moderate class conflict, or how consumer identity would often supersede class consciousness. His analysis didn't foresee the rise of the professional managerial class, or the complex stratifications within both capital and labor that characterize advanced economies. What makes Marx's analysis powerful isn't supernatural foresight, but his systematic examination of capitalism as a dynamic, contradiction-laden system. By identifying tensions between labor and capital, between technological capacity and social relations, between productive forces and political structures, Marx developed an analytical framework that continues to illuminate aspects of our economic order. In this way, Marx remains relevant not as a prophet but as an analyst, whose method helps us understand systemic patterns. His insights remind us that economic systems have histories and trajectories. They evolve according to internal logics that can be studied and understood. Whether one agrees with his politics or not, Marx's analytical approach to uncovering the developmental tendencies within capitalism offers tools for understanding our present moment and anticipating possible futures.